This is History for the Reckoning, a podcast that dives deep into the history that's hard to hear but critical to understand. Season 1, American Concentration Camps, the story of World War II Japanese incarceration. Listeners, welcome back to the podcast. We learned last time about the 10 massive WRA, or War Relocation Authority camps that incarcerated around 10,000 people each, but the government had many more camps used to incarcerate Japanese and Japanese Americans, these run by the Department of Justice, or DOJ. Here to tell us all about these much less public camps is today's guest, Claudia Katayanagi. Claudia is a historian, activist, and filmmaker. I first became aware of her work through her incredible documentary entitled A Bitter Legacy, an incredible overview of the entire history of Japanese World War II incarceration. She's also produced Community in Conflict, a film about the Santa Fe internment camp memorial controversy. But recently, Claudia has become an expert on the DOJ camps, our topic today, researching her upcoming documentary entitled Exiled, The Real Internment Story. That's a working title. She'll have it out very soon. That's all about the Department of Justice camps. Claudia, thank you for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me.
So we learned in our last episode that hours after Pearl Harbor had occurred, FBI were already knocking on people's doors and rounding people up and taking them away. So tell us first, who were the people that they were taking?
Well, the FBI had been spying on people of Japanese ancestry for years before the war, actually. So they knew exactly where to go. That's why they knew to go, before martial law was even declared, they had already arrested a Buddhist priest, at his temple, because they knew where to go. And this was, they used the justification of the Enemy Alien Act of 1798. That is, if you were at war with the country, then you could arrest the people who, aliens, people who were not American citizens, and put them into prisons. So that was the justification for the first group of people. So that's the Enemy Alien Act. And they had to have, it was run first by the military, and then the military became overwhelmed with all the POWs they were arresting, the German POWs, the Italian POWs.
You mean POWs are being shipped over from Europe?
In fact, one of the first camps was Fort Stanton, and in New Mexico, and Fort Missoula. And I just was in Fort Missoula last month.
Oh, cool.
And interviewed 3 historians there. And there were already 1,000 Italians in Fort Missoula before the Japanese prisoners were brought there.
Oh, wow.
They tended to be, the Italians were actually seamen who were captured on their boats in the East Coast. And they were scuttling on the Italian ships, and the English was going, hey, no, let's keep those ships. We can use them. They destroyed all our ships. We want to use them. Well, anyway, they started to arrest all these Italian seamen. They brought 1,000 of them to Fort Missoula, and they then in turn built the fence that imprisoned the Japanese.
Oh no.
Aliens when they came a little later. But this was all, so first Fort Stanton was run by the military, and because they were arrested, they had to, and they were aliens, they had to be governed by the Geneva Convention.
Okay.
So they were supposed to be given hearings, but a hearing had to have 3 people, a couple judges, local people, and a citizen. But they never. But the people who were the Japanese people brought there had no lawyers. They had no legal representation. It was basically kangaroo court.
So let's get you to these hearings. Yeah. So the Japanese are picked up at their homes. Where do they go first? Where did those hearings take place? And then tell us what the hearings were like.
The first they arrested priests, and they had an ABC list, people who were supposedly dangerous to this country. And they actually ended up being very arbitrary, that, sometimes they arrested people who were on the C list that weren't really. If you happened to own, one woman's husband owned a Japanese language newspaper, and that was considered, dangerous. But her husband had passed away. She owned the newspaper, and so she got arrested, because you don't hear of many women being arrested. But there were women, aliens, people who were not allowed to become, they didn't allow Japanese people to become American citizens until 1952.
Okay.
So you are technically an alien. And even though you're a resident for decades, you still are considered an alien. So she was like, this woman was arrested and put into Seagoville, Texas.
Okay.
It was a women's prison. They made it a women's prison. But they arrested Buddhist priests, all these people, and they started pulling them. There were 10 ships that came from Hawaii with, there were about 13 different camps in all throughout Hawaii that they would put them in jails, and Sand Island, they would build tents and put people in jails there, and Honolulu. And so they had quite a few number of people, Japanese citizens that they put into those camps. And they brought 10 ships over. 8 of them came through Angel Island in San Francisco.
Oh, cool.
It was an immigration center at one point, but they started, and then from there they would ship them off to dozens of other camps.
Yeah, so particularly these ones who are rounded up on the West Coast, I guess this would be before the ones arrive from Hawaii. What's the first stop that the FBI takes them to?
To jails, sometimes just simple jails, local jails, until they could figure out where to put them, because they hadn't built a lot. Fort Missoula was already built, so they just could easily bring them there, put them there. But again, it wasn't. There was a prison in Pacifica called Sharp Park, and they had Italians there as well, and then the Japanese. So they started pulling them out. I mean, I know some people were in North Beach in San Francisco. They were pulled out because they were fascists. They were Mussolini supporters. And
sure.
So if you were a Mussolini supporter, well, you were considered somewhat dangerous. So there were some Germans and who also, fascists. And so they arrested a few of those.
Yeah, you mentioned that they were supposed to have hearings. What were the hearings actually like that they were supposed to have?
Well, they just said, well, you're being charged with this. What do you have to say? Well, I'm not guilty of, this crime that you say I'm guilty of. I'm just running my business. Well, we think you're dangerous. And basically they just threw them in jail. And then and as they got more and more people, they would round them up and bring them to places like Fort Missoula or Fort Stanton or wherever. And then so this was right. The very first person to be arrested was before martial law was declared on December 7th. So they already began to arrest dozens of Japanese priests and business people in Hawaii and on the West Coast. They also, it was considered un-American to be Buddhist. So yeah, get all the Buddhists. But they did have a couple, Christian priests who were of Japanese ancestry. They did consider, they thought they were dangerous just because they were community leaders, right? So these poor people were brought to places, and then as they built up the camps, then a lot of the Buddhist priests ended up going to Santa Fe.
Okay, yeah.
So these camps were then first run by the military. When the military was overrun by the real POWs, then they asked the DOJ to take over the jurisdiction of these prisoners.
Oh, interesting.
Sometimes they put them in immigration centers, for a while. So there were over 100, almost 100 different sites.
Wow.
People have cited. People think, oh, there's just the 10 incarceration camps, And my folks were in Topaz. But these were for people who were theoretically American citizens. There were some who were not considered dangerous, like they were elderly or something. They were, I guess, not considered so dangerous. But Executive Order 9066 in February of 42 is what created the WRA camps for mostly, that most people are aware of, like Topaz, Minidoka,
the Big Ten,
Manzanar. Yeah, all the 10 camps. And then from there, they pulled out people who were starting to resist. Hey, what are we being charged for? Then they pulled them out as troublemakers and put them into Moab and then down to Loop, Arizona.
Okay, so you're saying that the DOJ camps started with these Issei non-citizens, but over time, as they quote-unquote found troublemakers in the camps, even if they were citizens, they got shuttled out to the DOJ camps.
Yeah. I mean, especially after 1943, when they made people sign a loyalty oath. Are you a loyal American citizen? Yes. Will you serve in the Army? I'll serve in the Army. My dad said, I'll serve in the Army when you free my family from this prison. We're American citizens. Why are we in this prison? Oh, well, they consider anybody who said yes and no, they still consider you a no-no. So what they did is they began to take all the people they considered troublemakers, and they created Tule Lake as a segregation center for people who resisted. And there were degrees of resistance. Some who were really pissed off and said, hey, this is un-American. This isn't just. We're gonna fight. And we're gonna resist.
Let's talk about the physical DOJ camps. How many were there? What's the range of size? Where are they located? What are they like? Describe the physical place in the variety that they came in.
They were spread all over the country, and because some of them were haphazardly put together, they were sort of building some of these places as these aliens were put into their, as they were waiting for their hearings. I mean, like in Hawaii, they put them into local jails and tents. They waited for weeks to get a hearing. Oh. And you can go to the archives, the National Archives, and people can look up. So you say you have a relative who was put in that. They actually have the hearing records.
Oh, wow.
What would they? I mean, but it's like, what are you accused? You're accused of doing this. Well, I'm not. People couldn't have a lawyer to really contest what they were being charged with. But anyway, they had hearings in Fort Missoula. They had a very extensive, really big hearing room which we filmed in. They've since renovated it, and it gives you a sense of the scale of how big these hearing rooms were. And basically, they would cycle through dozens of people a day and say, "You're guilty, you're guilty, you're guilty." And but they theoretically they could claim that they gave them a hearing for deniability, plausible deniability, but it's basically a PR show because they were. If prisoners don't have a lawyer, is that really a proper hearing or a trial? No, no. But they went through the charade of, oh, you had a hearing, so we can now imprison you.
Yeah.
And they did. So that's, I've Tetsuren Kashima, Professor Kashima has had exact numbers. I mean, he has figured out how many, prisoners that were put into these DOJ and military prisons. And initially there were, quite a few thousands. And then there was even a Buddhist priest in New York whose daughter I have met. She invited me to show my film After a Legacy at the Buddhist temple in New York. Her father was picked up by the DOJ in New York because he was a Buddhist priest, and he was sent to various prisons. He ended up at Fort Missoula. I think he went to Lordsburg for a while. He went to, and then he volunteered there was a volunteer DOJ camp called Kuski in Idaho. So I did a whole interview with this woman. I was very amazing. Because I thought, you could volunteer. They volunteered because they needed men to help build a road. So they had originally a fort. Kuski was at one point a real prison, and they hired the prisoners to work on the road. So they had all this equipment there, and then when they turned it from. They closed it down as a labor camp and made it a DOJ camp for aliens, and but what they determined is that, well, we can get these guys to work on it, but we have to pay them. So the guys who volunteered said, well, we can make 10 times more money as a road builder, and it was unique in that it didn't have fences around them, because where are they going to go? I mean, it's stuck in the middle of Idaho in the backcountry. I mean, it's beautiful country. For some of them, it was like, well, it's not the dry desert of all the other camps. So they saw pictures. Like, oh, it's green. It's and sort of mountain trees around. And they helped build 10 miles of the road or something, and it's now highway. What is it? Highway 125 or something? Highway 25. And so it's. There's a lot of work. I mean, some people got lots of injuries. They're hard rock that they had to drill through and bulldoze.
Yeah, so it sounds like they might have had possibly even a pleasant experience. They were just getting to work out in the open air. But what was the range of experience once they got to these camps? The good, the bad, the ugly?
Most of the camps. I mean, there were some that were... Lordsburg was notorious because it was run by this army guy who was really mean. He hated, he just hated everybody. And he made these... I mean, a lot of these aliens were elderly men, and in fact, in Lordsburg, they would drop them off. A lot of them came from all the other different camps, and they were made to walk. I think they're from Tule Lake. And they were made to walk from the train. There wasn't a train station. They just stopped at a landing, and they were made to walk 3 miles to the actual campsite. Well, these guys were elderly. They were injured. One guy had injured himself on a shrimping boat, and he had broken his back, could barely walk. But they made them walk. They were supposed to have a car for them, but they made them walk, and they're walking, and they had to go pee, and after the long train ride, and one guy said, "Okay, go." They had walking some more, and I got to go again. So the other guy had taken off, and the corporal then grabbed he says, "Get back on the road." He says, "I'm peeing," and he didn't speak that great English, but so his other friend said, "Hey, Joe, come on, get back on the road, get back on the road." Well, the guy just took his shotgun and shot them both dead for peeing, basically. Well, they're supposed to be on the road. He was court-martialed, and they let him go free. They said, "Yeah, you were right to shoot him."
Oh, geez.
They didn't get back on the road. So it was, and this guy he made the Issei men work outside in the hot steaming air, and then finally some others came and said, "Hey, this is governed by the Geneva Convention. We are not supposed to work. They can't make us work. Like if you want American POWs to go out and work, no, you don't. So you have to abide by the Geneva Convention." And so once then they went on strike.
Oh, really?
They said, "Hey, yeah." I mean, these are educated men. They knew their rights. They knew their rights were being not they were being denied. But they said, "Hey, let's just." So they went on strike, and eventually that guy got booted upstairs. He got let go, and they brought somebody else in. Was a little more compassionate. I mean, so each of these camps had a different atmosphere depending on who ran the camp. Some of them were more Fort Missoula. Fort Kuski. They were just much more compassionate. And they go, "Hey, these are human beings. I mean, they're doing their work. They have families." And in fact, that reverend that I spoke of, the Buddhist priest in Kuski, his family actually got to visit him for a week. Because they had, the administration had big cabins and people worked there. And so they let his family, two little baby, two sons, come with their mother, and they visited him for a week.
So some places you're experiencing forced labor, other places you're having almost a camp experience, just a whole range.
Yeah. I mean, there's only about 50-something men at the camp at the time, but they were working there, they were working hard, and they had the respect of, the other workers, and it raised the spirits of so many of the men because all these kids were there with at the camp. And that was an interesting story, to hear, because, you think all of them are just terrible, desolate and horrible places, but there's this one bright spot in that was kind of interesting to discover. But the majority of these places were, dreary, horrible. You're enclosed. They're bored out of their gourd because they can't go anywhere. Right. I was just in Bismarck, where they just created a beautiful. A lot of the Germans were sent to Bismarck. Most of the Italians were sent to Fort Missoula. I mean, there was that differentiation in terms of the ethnicity, and then the Japanese then were brought in. So they were kept somewhat separate. The Germans and the Japanese weren't really working together and eating together. They had different food for each of these ethnicities.
Oh, interesting.
The Germans in Bismarck got to make their own beer. Some of them got to go work in town. They were given a lot more liberty, whereas the Japanese couldn't for a while. Every now and then they would let them go into town, but they had a lot more freedom, and just the fact that in Bismarck they had better sleeping arrangements because they were in a brick building, so they weren't suffering the cold. Because Bismarck is pretty cold in the winter, but they had stoves, and there's a story of Sasuke and his father saying, "I feel guilty because I know my family's suffering in these WRA camps." But here I am in this building that's got it's warm, and and they have better food too, because in the DOJ, the Geneva Convention says that the prisoners have to eat the same food that the guards do.
Oh, okay.
So they got a little better treatment, and they got better food, and they all felt guilty because they knew that their
Right.
families were suffering in the WRA camps without that. But
very interesting.
but some of them were, suffering at Lordsburg for a number of months, and just there were camps all over the country. There are 4 internment camps in New Mexico itself. Between Fort Stanton was one of the first ones, and then Santa Fe and Lordsburg, but I was just amazed at how many of these camps there were, and it was also very interesting as I've done interviews with some of the descendants, and they described that their father had to go to 7 different camps. They moved from Angel Island. They went to Louisiana. They went to place just all over the country. Thousands of miles. They put on trains mostly, and
so you're saying that even after they were shipped out of where they were abducted, arrested, they wouldn't stay in one camp very long. They kept moving.
Yeah. And partially, it's one person said they thought it was because they didn't want them to form alliances with each other. They didn't, and also, they also didn't have, they hadn't prepared a lot of these prisons to hold people adequately. So they moved them as they were building, newer, bigger camps.
Okay.
So there was that as well. But I think they just wanted to keep them, keep them off their toes and just make them feel that insecurity of not knowing where you're going to be.
Sure.
And so they were moved to 7, sometimes 8 different camps.
Wow.
And some people kept diaries, and so now some of these stories are just now coming to light because they're written in Japanese.
Oh, cool.
And so there's some translations that are occurring. You go, oh, look at this. Satsuki Ina has written a book about her family. Her father was one of the he was a Nono boy basically, and so he was beaten up in Tule Lake, and then from Tule Lake he went to Bismarck, and then to Santa Fe, and then at a certain point they started in 43. They began to bring in a lot of Japanese Latin American prisoners. The American government went to 15 different Latin American countries who said that they would give up their Japanese citizens. The American government paid them to do this. Wow. El Salvador was one of them. And ironically, they said, here, take our Japanese, and then here's some money. So the American government gave the government of El Salvador money for their Japanese. They put them on boats. I think they collected a lot of them into Panama. And then they brought them to the mainland. And they took away their passports, put them into prisons, in New Orleans, in Texas, and then they eventually brought them they created a family prison in the DOJ system called Crystal City, Texas. So there were a lot of Latin American Japanese stuck in a prison where they didn't speak English, and right. They only spoke Spanish because that's where they were born. So they had to learn Japanese. Some people, their parents might have to speak Japanese, so they had to, it was crazy.
Yeah, you mentioned that the U.S. went to 15 countries in South America and Central America to ask to purchase their Japanese. What did other countries do? There's a lot more than 16 countries around us.
Well, Mexico said you can't have ours, but they made them move, 500 miles away from the border.
Okay.
Or, they couldn't go out at night. They gave a few restrictions, but they didn't send them off to prison camps. So Mexico said no. Brazil said, nope, you're not taking our Japanese citizens.
I guess I'm wondering what happened in Canada. They're right next to us.
Well, Canada had tons of people in their prisons, yeah.
Oh, they had their own prisons?
They had their own incarceration camps.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And they treated their prisoners even worse. They confiscated their money. And then they used that money to they had to buy their own food, basically.
Oh, geez.
Whereas at least in the WRA camps, the government paid for the food. But, they were treated really, really badly. They got very much less reparations later on. There's still some people are being apologized to because only some people are finding out, oh, my God, they had a camp for Canadian Japanese here. And, so there's some good films coming out about that story too.
Yeah, I want to tell the listeners about Claudia and I actually not too long ago went to one of these sites that was in Moab, Utah. So that's a very
Oh,
small site. But one thing that really struck me is how boring it was. Like they were there for years. They had little contact with the outside world, incredibly boring. But sometimes they made the best of it. I wonder if you can talk about day-to-day life, what they did with their time.
well, because these were educated men, in the DOJ camps. They were they could read. They read. They were artists. So they just made the best of the. They had some sports they could do. Some of them played baseball.
Oh, cool.
Um, what do you do when you got nothing else? You can't. So some of them made gardens if they could. You could. My mom said that they could buy things from Montgomery Wards, mail order.
Oh, nice.
It's like their Amazon of the day
Right.
was to go to Monkey Wards or to they called it Monkey Wards then, and they could order, things if they had the money. In the DOJ camps, they when people are imprisoned and you've got nothing else to do, you get to be pretty creative,
Yep.
and you find ways to pass the time. And some people did wood carving, some painted. I mean, the artistry came out, and I mean, the Japanese are encouraged to be artistic.
Okay.
To do calligraphy or to, my grandmother was a flower arranger, did ikebana for a living actually, and people could sew. They got sewing machines. In the DOJ camps, they tended to be only men, so it was really tough. So what do men do? They play. The one couple camps they kind of created a golf course out of sand. It's just you go, well, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? So one couple places they allowed them to go in Kuski. They allowed them to go fishing.
Cool.
Just off hours.
Sure.
But by and large, it's pretty boring, as you said. It's like you're stuck there in the middle of this dry, horrible place, and you can write. I mean, a lot of people wrote letters to their families. Of course, they were censored.
Let me ask you that. So what contact did they have with their families, the outside world?
They were allowed to write letters. You could write. You were limited by the number of letters you could write and the number of words you could put in one letter.
Interesting.
And you could not talk about the conditions of the camp or where you were exactly, or the censors would read every single letter going in and out of these camps. So some people describe, getting a letter and it's all chopped scissors and chopped out whole sections of the letter. But people learned, okay, you don't talk about that. So they would write about how they missed their I think they were, when cameras were allowed, they were this one person, the priest that was in Kuski said he got a picture sent of his two sons. Where their babe, one was a baby and one was 1 year old. And, just that seeing a picture of your kids when you're stuck in this prison for 4 years, 5 years. I mean, these men were there from 41 to some of them through 1947.
Wow.
So people think, oh, it was only 40, 42. No, some of these men were stuck there for that many years. And some of them had in these hearings, when they said, oh, we made a mistake. You really aren't a dangerous person. So they didn't get released, but they got paroled to the WRA camp.
Oh, but that's where many of their families were, so that's a little bit better.
Yeah. And not that many, but a few were like, okay, you're not dangerous, really. You were a cook in a restaurant. I mean, really, come on, why are you here? And then sometimes they would go, okay, well, we can't release you out into the world, but we'll parole you to the WRA camp. And there was a story of one man I just interviewed. His father was put into a DOJ camp, and he was sent to this prison in outside of Tucson, Arizona, and it was like a work camp. It was he was sent to the camp, and he was released early on because of good behavior. He had done his work, and he was they released him. But he said, "Well, I can go see my family." No, you're just released. They didn't let him go to a you can't go into a WRA camp because you're released.
Oh.
You're paroled. You're free to go. And he really? So his family was in Minidoka. he goes down to Minidoka. He gets a job at a fish market there, and then he goes to the campsite to Minidoka at night, sneaks under the barbed wire fence to visit his
Oh,
family because he's got, he's really devoted. The family was really close, and he missed them.
yeah.
And his parents were a bit, elderly, and so he would go in and be with family for a couple hours, and then the guards were coming. Oh, guards are coming! Quick, get out of here! So he would sneak out at night. But it's the odd story of sneaking back into a prison camp just to be with family.
Oh, that is a crazy story.
But it's like family was so important. You're separated. I mean, family separation is again happening now, but it happened then. And so many families were separated. When you think of the thousands of men who were just dragged away, and then these families didn't have their father or their husband there for years, and that it was very harsh environment, and all these women had to somehow, if we have 2 or 3 kids and they're got no husband around, it's really tough. I mean, sometimes the community got together and helped them out, sure, but still the family was without their father,
Yeah.
and so there are some sad stories about not seeing their fathers, and so the family separation that's the hardest issue of this. If you pick up thousands of men and send them to these prisons, that's one thing. But then you go, yeah, but what happened to their families? Then they were picked up and put into the WRA camps. Some of them were the women who were picked up because they owned Japanese language school teachers were also picked up. So there were women that were brought to Seagoville, Texas, and then sometimes from there they were occasionally allowed to go to Crystal City to join the family there. So families sometimes were unified, but they were still in a prison.
Right. Yeah, I wanted to ask you, as the war progressed, how did treatment change? Because as you mentioned, they realized over time, some men, you're really not a threat. You get to go to the WRA camps, maybe even go completely free. But also, the war started, tensions were very high. Pearl Harbor had just happened. The war had just started. So maybe there was a lot of resentment toward these Japanese. How did that shift over time, if at all?
Well, I think like in Santa Fe, that the example there was that they thought, a lot of the people there thought this was a prisoner of war camp, and that didn't. But one afternoon, the local paper, ran a picture of a Japanese American man wearing his U.S. Army uniform, standing behind the casket of his father who had died in Santa Fe. And all the Buddhist priests were, since there were so many Buddhist priests in Santa Fe, they were behind him in the ceremony and the funeral service.
You're saying a Japanese American who was serving in World War II.
In World War II, in the U.S. Army, wearing his World War II U.S. Army uniform. And so these other people in the community went, oh, what? He's fighting with us? This Japanese guy is fighting with us? He's in our army? Yes, they're American citizens. And that kind of changed a few people's minds about, oh, well, I'm sorry that they're, these American citizens are in a camp. Some people's attitude changed slightly, but, I mean, I can understand. What I didn't understand in Santa Fe was that a lot of the veterans from Santa Fe were in the Bataan Death March. And they were treated horribly by the Japanese military.
Oh, so you mean these are typically white Americans that had been serving in the Philippines during World War II, have been treated horribly by the Japanese Empire. And
so I didn't, I kind of knew about it, but when I read more and talked to a lot of these descendants and realized, well, of course they would be, but but what they didn't understand was the Santa Fe camp wasn't the military camp, wasn't for POWs or people who served in the Japanese military. They were American residents. And so some of them came around and others said, I don't care who they are. They're Japs, Jap is a Jap kind of attitude. That was then. And yes, the tensions were high and it's understandable. But to imprison 125,000 people, Japanese ancestry, because of their ancestry, that they didn't do it the same number of Germans. I mean, we were at war with Germany, but it was a minuscule percentage of Germans who were imprisoned and a minuscule amount of even less Italian aliens who were imprisoned. But I do tell the story of the Italians and the Germans because that's part of the internment process as well. And
yeah, you're right. Their story too. I wonder if we can change gears just a little bit. You've mentioned a couple times as a large camp called Crystal City in Texas that you described as the family detention centers. So tell us about Crystal City.
Well, Crystal City, when they started, realizing that they had to release some of these guys from the DOJ camps and reunite them with their families, but they were also closing down these other camps. Like the WRA camps were starting to close down. Santa Fe was starting to close down in 1943. So they would release these guys, and they said, well, I guess we're not going to release you out in the world, but, we'll reunite you with your family. So since the other camps were closing down, they created Crystal City and made it a family camp. And there were slightly better conditions at Crystal City. I mean,
so there's a situation where typically the men were they were not free to go. They still had to be in prison, but they would let them be reunited with their families. So the family had to be in prison so that they could be with their father, but the father was the one who was not free to go. Is that correct?
Well, no, they were all not allowed to go. They kept them there until some camps. My mom, for example, was released in 45, I guess, and but they couldn't go back to the West Coast for quite a while. Right. So she ended up going to Chicago for a while, and then when they said, okay, now you can go back to the West Coast, they gave them you're allowed to have one train ride. So, that's how some of them came back.
So Crystal City is now the family place where these men who'd been away from their families for years, and then their families, many of whom had been in the WRA camps. Yeah, sorry, I cut you off before. So keep telling us about Crystal City.
And so that's where they could join up. But they weren't allowed to go out to be free. But they were in Crystal City. It was. Again, I mean, they had a swimming pool. I mean, a lake, body of water they made into a pool. They had whole sections that were the Latino, Japanese.
Oh, they weren't allowed to go back to their home countries. They were stuck.
No, they weren't allowed. They were there for years as well. And, so there was quite a variety of, in the population there. And I have since gone to the first Crystal City pilgrimage.
Wow.
And the town was so wonderful. They said, oh, we've been waiting for you to come back because we have some stones from the pool, but we wanted to share with you. And they made a plaque stating that this was a prison camp, and all these thousands of Japanese were unlawfully imprisoned here, and we're sorry, kind of thing. Some of these camps in New Mexico, one of them, they apologized. They did a formal apology for imprisoning the Japanese people and said this was wrong, and we're sorry. And they had a parade and honored them. It's not that often that happened, but some cities have apologized, for the internment or the incarceration, because they realized that it was unjust.
You mentioned that Crystal City was where they put people after some other camps were closed. So how long was Crystal City open, or until what?
It was open until 1947.
Until 1947. 2 years after the war is completely over.
Yes.
Why were they still there in 1947?
They didn't know they didn't want to release them. They didn't know where to put them. There were a lot of the Latin Americans they took their passports away. When they were on the ships coming from their Latin American countries, and they didn't give it back to them. And at the end of the war, they had no passports, so they were countryless. And some of them were, what the government was also trying to do was to get a lot of these aliens or renunciants, people who were American citizens who were so pissed off that they said, I'm going to renounce my American citizenship and go back to Japan, or I'm just going to renounce my citizenship because I'm as a statement of being pissed off. They said, this is unjust. I'm going to renounce my American citizenship. Well, they wanted these people to renounce, and then they wanted to use them to ship them to Japan. in exchange for the American POWs.
Okay. So you're saying that the government wanted them to renounce their citizenship, maybe
yes,
even coerced
it
them.
was-
How would you describe it?
yes, they quite often coerced. I mean, there's a section in when I just found this out from a movie film. Some friends who did a film about Tule Lake. There were some renunciants who were resisting even being put in this, being shipped out of Tule Lake. They were trying to be shipped them, put them on boats to take them off, ship them off to Japan, and they refused to go, and because I was wondering why they were in their underwear. They stripped off to the underwear and got on their beds and refused to be shipped off.
Mhm.
And then that's when the guards came in and started beating them up and carrying them by the feet and
Jeez.
dragging them out into the trains to take them to boats. So there were those who resisted, and they were forced to go to these other camps.
Yeah, sorry, maybe to summarize just for me, it's like the U.S. government wanted more Japanese citizens to trade in order to get American citizens back that were POWs, but they didn't have enough.
Mhm.
So they were hoping that a lot of American citizens would give away their citizenship to become non-citizens, and therefore they could become trading objects, bargaining chips for POW exchange.
Yes. That was a large, a big movement in the DOJ system, because they wanted. At one point, the Japanese government said, "Wait a minute, these are American citizens. You're forcing them to? No, we don't want them."
Wow.
No, that's not right. They have to be genuine, aliens, because they understood what was going on. But there were some who said, "Screw it, I want to go." Some people said, in order to keep the family together, they had their kids renounce their citizenship because they said, "Let's, I'm fed up with this going on. Look at the way they're treating us here.
Mhm.
Well, let's go to Japan." So my kids are going, "I've never been to Japan. I don't speak Japanese. What am I going to do there?" They didn't want to go, but the father would go, "Got to keep the family together.
Sure.
Got to go." So they renounced. And I have a story of Hiroshi Shimizu, whose father said this to him, and he was a little kid. And they were literally shipped from Crystal City. They went up to, they're at Ellis Island for a while, and they were getting ready to be put on the ships. And they got to the shipyard, and they said, "Oh, there's no room for you. We don't have enough room." Because they were anticipating some people on the previous ship said, "No, we don't want to go after
Sure.
all." So they had empty, they didn't have enough people on there. So that meant that fewer Americans could be exchanged. So in order to compensate for that, they overbooked the number of people who said they were going to renounce. And so Hiroshi's family were considered, "Oh, there's too many people, you can't go." So fortunately, his family didn't get deported. He got to stay in this country.
How lucky.
But he had already renounced, so he had to go through Wayne Collins years later. Wayne Collins was the ACLU lawyer who got thousands of Japanese people who were forced to renounce. They got their American citizenship back, and he had to have hearings, to prove, that to say that they wanted their citizenship back, and this was unlawful the way they made them renounce. But the government wouldn't allow him to do it as a class action suit, so he had to
One by one,
affidavits for
thousands
every
of
single
people.
person. Yeah, and I mentioned that in my A Bitter Legacy film, because I interviewed his son extensively, and he's a hero, in the Japanese American community. Wayne Collins, for all his dedication in getting all these people their citizenship back.
So you mentioned that some of these towns that hosted these Department of Justice camps have had a reckoning, maybe even apologized. What was the reaction of these other nations, particularly the Latin American countries, Canada, that either imprisoned or sent their Japanese citizens to be imprisoned?
Well, Canada had their own, come to Jesus moment in that they had. I mean, in this country, we had the Civil Liberties Act, which was passed, and then a formal apology by the U.S. government, and reparations money given to the Japanese who were Americans who were incarcerated or interned during the war. In Canada, they didn't. They got a minuscule amount of money, and but they did finally come around and apologize to their Japanese Canadians, and but Latin American, not so much. They didn't. Peru, for example, similar to what how the farmers here in America, in California, they go, oh, we got the land, hey, we don't want them back here. They took their businesses, their land, their because they were tended to be very successful, these Japanese, in these different countries. Even the Japanese basically turned the Central Valley of California into what it is today. And if they had, did an estimate, if we were able to keep that land, they'd be, billionaires, right now, with the amount of land that they had and the even the crops they lost from that one year.
Yeah.
Tens of thousands of dollars. But anyway, the Peruvians, they said, no, keep them out of here. We got the land, we got their property, we got their business. No, we don't want them back here. So they made it very hard to come back. And then, ironically, they elected a Japanese president.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, years later. But, I'd like to go. I'd like to do a whole separate film on the Japanese Latin American,
absolutely,
stories. Because in Panama, they had a prison there. And I think they gathered a lot of them and put them into Panama, the jail in Panama. And it was called Lone Pine or something. And then from Panama, they would ship them over, to New Orleans or to other places. And then they made their way to, some of them went to Sharp Park in Pacifica, California.
Oh, wow.
Some of them went to, but most of them ended up in Crystal City. And there are a few who resisted and who were fighting for their full reparations. And to this, in the world, the U.S. courts refused to hear the case, but the World Court said we'll hear it, and they ruled in favor of the judgment of the Latin Americans and from Peru, and said, yeah, you guys have to. The U.S. government has to pay the full reparations to these Latin Americans, and they haven't yet. But
sure.
They're still fighting. They won in court, but the fight goes on.
Yeah. So Claudia, based on this history that you've shared with us, all this extensive research that you've done, what do you hope that our listeners will take away from this history and from the things you've shared?
History has a way of teaching you if you're willing to learn, and I just do my bit. Every time I show my film, I ask people in the audience how many people have learned something from after watching my film that they didn't know before, and almost every hand goes up. And that to me is encouraging. It's motivating, and I think when people really are willing to learn, you have to be willing to learn for sure, and that like this people who say they voted for this one thing and they go, oh, I see, I shouldn't have done that, or I was misled, and so when people get educated and they go, okay, where's the way to go now? And I think people really want what's best for themselves, for their families, and for the country and the world. And I'm hopeful that's the view that will endure.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Claudia. Thank you for coming on, and I hope that everyone follows the links that we'll have on our website and find Claudia's work, because she does such incredible things, and I'm so excited to see your next film.
Oh, so am I.
Thank you, Claudia.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Spencer. Thank you very much.
Season 1 of History for the Reckoning is made possible by support from the JACL Mount Olympus chapter, as well as generous financial support from the Takahashi Family Foundation and the JA Community Foundation. The music was produced by Patrick Coffin. If you want to support the show, follow us on Instagram at History for the Reckoning. Sign up for our newsletter at History for the Reckoning on Substack, where you'll also find the show notes for each episode, or support us financially through Patreon at patreon.com/historyforthereckoning.